It was a bleak, drizzly evening in London, the kind that seemed to weigh heavily on one's spirit. The flicker of street lamps outside cast trembling shadows across the window panes of Hercule Poirot's pristine apartment. Inside, the warmth of a crackling fire fought against the gloom. Poirot sat in his usual chair, the steam from his perfectly brewed tisane curling into the air as he meticulously trimmed a stray thread from his cuff. A sudden knock at the door shattered the peaceful ambiance. Poirot's sharp eyes flicked toward the entrance. The knock came again, more urgent this time. Few visitors came at this hour without good reason. Poirot, always a connoisseur of human drama, sensed that something unusual awaited him. "Entrez," he called calmly, his voice steady but commanding. The door creaked open to reveal Miss Carnaby, a woman of gentle demeanor, now visibly shaken. Her rain-drenched coat clung to her shoulders, and her gloved hands trembled as she clutched a crumpled letter. Her usually composed face was pale, eyes darting nervously as if the shadows themselves might lunge at her. "Miss Carnaby," Poirot rose with concern. "Monday do what troubles you so?" "Monsieur Poirot," it didn't know where else to go. Her voice quivered. "It's my friend Amelia. She's dead." "Dead?" Poirot's brow furrowed as he gestured for her to sit. "I am most sorry, but why come to me, mademoiselle?" Miss Carnaby sank into the chair opposite him, barely able to contain herself. She joined this strange group, the Flock of Geryon. "They claim to offer spiritual enlightenment, but Amelia confided in me. Disturbing things, and now she's dead. They say it was an accident, but I know better." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "The Flock of Geryon," he echoed, leaning forward. "Tell me everything." "They're led by a man called Dr. Andersen, charismatic, charming, but there's something unsettling about him. Amelia mentioned ceremonies, frightening rituals, and now—" She faltered, her voice catching. "She sent me this letter just before she died." Poirot took the letter with precision, unfolding it carefully. The paper trembled slightly in his hand as he read aloud. "Mary, I fear for my soul. The ceremonies are not what they seem. Dr. Andersen has a power over us, one I cannot explain. If anything happens to me, know that I was right to be afraid." The ink trailed off abruptly, as though Amelia had been interrupted. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. He folded the letter neatly and looked back at Miss Carnaby, whose knuckles were white as she gripped the edge of the chair. "I believe your fears are justified, mademoiselle," he said gravely. "But Hercule Poirot shall get to the heart of this matter. Of that, you have my word." A gust of wind rattled the window pane, echoing through the room like a sinister whisper. Miss Carnaby shuddered. "Do you think I'm in danger too?" Poirot's mustache twitched as he pondered her question. "Let us just say, Miss Carnaby, that danger often shadows those who seek the truth. But fear not, Poirot shall see you safe." Cliffhanger ending. Before Miss Carnaby could respond, there was a faint but deliberate sound outside, a slow scrape of footsteps on the cobblestone street below. Poirot's head snapped toward the window, his expression hardening. "You were not followed, were you?" he asked quietly. I don't think so," Miss Carnaby stammered. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the street, where the silhouette of a figure lingered beneath the flickering lamplight. The figure stood motionless, as if waiting, watching. The room seemed to grow colder. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then I fear, mademoiselle, that the Flock of Geryon may already know you are here. The investigation begins." Poirot sat back, his sharp gray eyes gleaming with interest as he observed Miss Carnaby, who now clutched a delicate porcelain teacup between trembling fingers. The warmth of the tea had not steadied her nerves. If anything, her anxiety had grown under the weight of the unsaid. Poirot leaned forward, his voice low but commanding. "Miss Carnaby, you must tell me everything you know about this so-called Flock of Geryon." Her lips quivered as she spoke. "It began so innocently, Monsieur Poirot. My friend Amelia had always been fascinated by spiritual groups. She found solace in their gatherings, at least. That's what she told me. But when she mentioned Dr. Andersen, I knew something was wrong." "Dr. Andersen," Poirot echoed, his mustache twitching with intrigue. "A charismatic man with strange eye-piercing, cold, He speaks with such conviction that you begin to doubt your own thoughts. Amelia described feeling controlled, as if her will was no longer her own. He promised enlightenment, liberation from worldly fears. But she was terrified. Poirot's brows knitted together. Ah, and how did this terror manifest? Miss Carnaby's gaze dropped to the floor. She became secretive, paranoid. One evening she begged me to destroy certain letters she had received from the group. I should have insisted on reading them, but she was so desperate. Then she stopped answering my calls, and now she's dead. Her voice broke. Poirot's voice softened. I am most sorry, mademoiselle, but we must not allow grief to cloud reason. You said Dr. Andersen exerts a strange influence. Tell me, where does this flock gather? At an isolated manor outside the city, she whispered. They say the air there is different, charged with spiritual energy. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. Charged with nonsense, no doubt. His tone grew serious again. And these gatherings, do they involve rituals? Miss Carnaby nodded hesitantly. Amelia mentioned a cleansing ceremony, but she wouldn't say more. She looked haunted when she spoke of it, as though she'd witnessed something unspeakable. Poirot tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the armrest. Cleansing, eh? Often a euphemism for something far less innocent. He fixed her with a penetrating gaze. Would you be willing to go undercover, Miss Carnaby? Her eyes widened. Undercover? Yes, mademoiselle. You are known to the flock, yes. She nodded nervously. Then you must return, but this time with Hercule Poirot guiding your every step. Miss Carnaby swallowed hard. You think I can do this? I have every confidence in you, Poirot said firmly. You possess a courage many would envy, mademoiselle. But what if they discover me? She whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Poirot's expression turned grave. Then we shall be ready. But remember, Miss Carnaby appear as the devoted follower, no more, no less, and report every detail to me. Cliffhanger ending. A tense silence settled between them until Miss Carnaby finally nodded, resolve hardening her features. Very well, Monsieur Poirot. I'll do it. Poirot's sharp eyes gleamed with approval. Bon, we shall unravel this sinister cult thread by thread. But before he could say more, a faint noise from outside the window drew his attention, a rustle of movement where none should be. Poirot's gaze flicked sharply toward the curtains, the shadows beyond shifting ominously. Miss Carnaby, he said quietly, it seems the flock may already be aware of your intentions. Miss Carnaby gasped, clutching her handbag tighter. Poirot's lips curled into a grim smile. But that, mademoiselle, only makes the hunt all the more intriguing. Uncovering secrets, twists begin. The moon hung high above the mist-shrouded hills, casting a ghostly pallor over the isolated manor. The air was thick with fog, and every step Miss Carnaby took toward the gates seemed to echo with the weight of unseen eyes. Her heart beat faster, her pulse quickening as she reached for the heavy iron handle of the gate, feeling a chill run down her spine. Inside, the manor was cold, unwelcome yet strangely serene. The walls seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't quite place, an undercurrent of something dark. She had been here before, as a visitor, but tonight, she was a participant in something far more dangerous. The Flock of Geryon had a ritual that bound its followers to their leader, Dr. Andersen. Miss Carnaby had watched from the shadows as they had assembled earlier that evening, silent, obedient, their faces obscured beneath hoods. Now, as she stepped into the candlelit hall, she could feel the weight of their stares, the invisible pull of their presence. Dr. Andersen stood at the center of the room, his back straight, his smile warm but calculated. His eyes, though, were cold-piercing. He had that unsettling charm, a quality that made you want to trust him, yet made your skin crawl. "Welcome, my dear," he said smoothly, his voice rich and melodious. "Tonight, we embark on a journey of liberation. Let us shed our worldly chains and embrace the true freedom of the spirit." Miss Carnaby forced a smile, her hand trembling slightly as she clasped it behind her back. She nodded, trying to appear like the devoted follower she had been instructed to become. The ritual began, and soon the others had joined in the chantlo, rhythmic, hypnotic. It was a sound that seemed to seep into her very bones, the words incomprehensible yet soothing, almost as if they were calling her to something she could not resist. But as the minutes passed, the unease grew. A feeling of dread settled over Miss Carnaby, something darker than the shadows that danced around the flickering candlelight. She had heard rumors of strange happenings within these walls, disappearances, deaths ruled as accidents, but here. Now she could almost taste the danger. Outside the circle, Dr. Andersen's followers moved in synchrony, their faces obscured by the hooded robes. The leader's gaze never left Miss Carnaby as he spoke again, his voice carrying a new edge. To be truly free, we must let go of the ties that bind us to the past, and that includes the guilt of our former lives. At those words, Miss Carnaby's pulse quickened. What had she gotten herself into? Meanwhile, far from the ritual's reach, Hercule Poirot was observing from a distance. Dressed in the shadows, he moved stealthily through the winding streets, his sharp eyes never missing a detail. He had spent the last few days following the members of the cult, gathering information, speaking to those who had left the group in fear. One man, a former follower, had been particularly revealing. "It starts out as an awakening, you know," he had said, "a sense of purpose, of being chosen. But then the control, the manipulation. You can't see it until it's too late." Poirot had pressed further, his voice a calm contrast to the man's distress. "What happened to those who tried to leave?" The man's face twisted in dread. "They vanish, quietly. No one dares to speak of it. Dr. Andersen, he's a dangerous man." Now, Poirot stood in a darkened alley just beyond the manor's gates, his eyes narrowed as he studied the cult members entering and leaving. The pieces were falling into place, but one question remained: why? Why had Amelia been targeted? Why the strange deaths? The whispers of the past mingled with the soft rustling of leaves as Poirot turned on his heel. The truth was closer than ever, but he needed one more clue, one more step. Cliffhanger ending. Back inside the manor, Miss Carnaby's head spun as the chant reached its crescendo. The air grew heavier, and she could feel herself losing control, the weight of their words pressing against her chest. The others around her seemed entranced, their faces blank, eyes empty. But then something caught her eye. A door at the far end of the room, hidden in the shadows. It creaked open slowly, and from it emerged a figure, pale, ghostly, eyes wide with terror. Miss Carnaby's breath caught in her throat. It was Amelia, but it couldn't be. She had been dead. Before she could react, Dr. Andersen's voice rang out, silencing the room. "No one leaves until they understand the truth. This is the final cleansing." And with that, the door slammed shut. Miss Carnaby stood frozen, her pulse racing. She had uncovered something horrifying, but the truth was far from clear. And as the chanting began once more, Poirot's voice echoed in her mind. "The human mind is the greatest puzzle of all. What will Miss Carnaby discover behind that door? Will Poirot be able to unravel the mystery in time?" The midpoint twist. The manor's labyrinthine halls seemed to stretch on forever, as Miss Carnaby maneuvered through the maze of corridors, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath her feet. She had been searching for hours, her eyes darting over every inch of the space, her senses heightened, knowing that the key to uncovering Dr. Andersen's dark secrets lay somewhere within these walls. Her heart pounded as she pushed open a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall. Inside, she found a dimly lit study, a large oak desk littered with papers and books, the air heavy with the smell of old parchment. She approached cautiously, feeling a strange presence behind her, but dismissed it as the anxiety creeping up her spine. She needed to focus. On the desk lay a set of ledgers, their leather covers worn and cracked with age. But it wasn't their age that caught her attention, it was the content. As she flipped through the pages, the disturbing truth began to unfold before her eyes. The ledgers were filled with the names of wealthy individuals, each marked with large sums of money, their donations to the Flock of Geryon seemingly endless. These weren't just donations, Miss Carnaby realized, with a sinking heart. These were extortions. The members of the cult had been financially exploiting the vulnerable, and the sums listed were staggering: properties, jewelry, businesses. Everything had been acquired under false pretenses, and the names of those involved were unmistakably powerful. Miss Carnaby's stomach churned as she thought of Amelia, how she had been lured into this trap by promises of spiritual salvation, only to become just another pawn in Dr. Andersen's deadly game. But just as she was about to turn the page, a shadow fell across the door. A cold breath tickled her neck, and she quickly stuffed the ledgers into her bag, her pulse quickening. Someone was coming. She darted into the nearest closet, holding her breath as footsteps echoed down the corridor. A low murmur followed, and the sound of a door creaking open filled the silence. Miss Carnaby pressed herself into the corner, trying to steady her shaking hands, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. Meanwhile, across the town, Poirot was piecing together the fragments of the investigation. His mind worked in overdrive, each new piece of evidence fitting together with clinical precision. He had spoken to more defectors, each one more fearful than the last. But it was the series of deaths among the cult members that intrigued him. The deaths had all been ruled as accidents, but Poirot had never believed in coincidences. There was something far darker at play. His mind returned to the coded message he had found, a cryptic series of symbols scrawled on the back of an old book. He had spent hours deciphering it, and at last, the message was clear. A poison used in the cleansing ceremonies. Poirot felt a chill race down his spine. The cult's rituals had always seemed more sinister than spiritual, but this new revelation made the danger palpable. If Dr. Andersen was using poison during these ceremonies, then Miss Carnaby was in far more danger than he had initially realized. Cliffhanger ending. Back at the manor, Miss Carnaby managed to slip past the watchful eye of the cult members, her heart still racing from the close call. She could barely breathe as she retraced her steps, desperate to return to the study and continue her search. But just as she rounded the corner, she heard voice low, menacing, but unmistakable. The voice of Dr. Andersen. "The time is drawing near. We can't wait any longer. The final cleansing must take place tonight." The words sent a jolt of fear through her. Tonight. What did he mean by the final cleansing? And then, she saw as a figure standing in the doorway of the study. A hooded member of the cult, staring straight at her with eyes full of recognition. In that moment, Miss Carnaby knew that everything she had uncovered was only the beginning. Dr. Andersen's true intentions were still shrouded in mystery, and she was about to uncover a truth that could cost her life. As she backed away slowly, she realized with mounting dread that she might already be too late. Will Miss Carnaby escape in time to warn Poirot? What is the true purpose of Dr. Andersen's final cleansing? The final act. The evening of the grand ritual had arrived, casting a heavy, oppressive air over the manor. A blood-red moon hung low in the sky, its eerie glow illuminating the mist that curled like tendrils around the hills. The silence of the night was broken only by the distant sound of drum slow, rhythmic, and haunting. It was the kind of music that spoke of ancient rites, of forbidden things best left undisturbed. Inside the manor, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The cult members had gathered in the main hall, their faces masked by elaborate veils, their eyes glittering with fanatic devotion. At the far end of the room, an altar was set with candles, their flames flickering in the dim light, casting long ghostly shadows on the walls. Dr. Andersen stood at the front, his calm, composed demeanor giving no hint of the malevolence simmering beneath the surface. Dressed in ceremonial robes, he spoke in a low, soothing tone, drawing the members into a trance-like state with his words. To any observer, he was the picture of grace and poised the perfect leader for such a cult. But to Poirot, he was nothing more than a puppet master, pulling the strings with deadly precision. Poirot had been watching from the shadows for hours, his mind racing as he pieced together the final pieces of the puzzle. It was time to make his move. Miss Carnaby, ever the brave soul, stood near the altar, her hand hidden beneath the folds of her cloak, where a small microphone was tucked away. She had been rehearsing her confrontation for days, knowing that this moment was her only chance to expose Dr. Andersen's true nature. With a steadying breath, she stepped forward, her face composed but her heart hammering in her chest. Dr. Andersen noticed her almost immediately, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. There was something unsettling about the way he regarded her, like a predator eyeing its prey. He smiled, his lips curling into a knowing smirk. "Ah, Miss Carnaby," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "You have arrived at last, ready to join us in our sacred cleansing, I presume." She gave a tight smile, forcing herself to remain calm. "Not quite, Dr. Andersen," she replied, her voice trembling just slightly despite her efforts to conceal it. "I'm here to stop you." For a moment, there was silence. The cult members all turned their gaze toward her, but Dr. Andersen's expression remained eerily unchanged. It was as if he had been expecting this. "You misunderstand, Miss Carnaby," he said, his voice like honey, dripping with condescension. "You think you can stop something as grand as the Flock of Geryon. You think you can dismantle a vision that has taken decades to build." At the signal from Poirot, Miss Carnaby pressed a hidden button on her wrist, activating the microphone. Poirot, concealed behind a tapestry at the back of the room, listened intently. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. As Dr. Andersen began to speak again, his words seemed to grow colder, more insidious. "You see, Miss Carnaby," he continued, "spiritual liberation comes at a price. The wealthy and the power people, like your dear friend Amelia, were merely tools to fund this higher purpose." Poirot's voice cut through the air like a blade, startling everyone in the room. "You are mistaken, Dr. Andersen." The room fell dead silent as Poirot stepped forward, his sharp eyes focused on the cult leader. The calm facade Dr. Andersen had worn for so long shattered, and for the first time there was a flicker of something darker, something far more dangerous beneath the surface. "You orchestrated the deaths of those you deemed expendable, didn't you?" Poirot accused, his voice ringing with authority. "You used your cleansing ceremonies as a means to eliminate those who stood in your way, all the while lining your pockets with their wealth." The cult members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Poirot and Dr. Andersen. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as the weight of Poirot's words settled in. But Dr. Andersen, ever the manipulator, regained his composure in an instant, his face twisting into a cold smile. "You think I did it for money, Poirot?" Dr. Andersen sneered. "You misunderstand entirely. What I do for a higher calling, something you can never comprehend. But perhaps you're right about one thing." His eyes flicked to Miss Carnaby. "Perhaps it is time for the final cleansing." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. He had known that Dr. Andersen was dangerous, but this was something far worse than he had imagined. As Dr. Andersen stepped toward the altar, a sense of foreboding filled the room. The cult members began to chant, their voices rising in eerie unison. It was as though they were being drawn into something far more sinister, something that could not be undone. Miss Carnaby took a step back, her hand trembling as she tried to steady herself. Poirot's mind raced. He had one chance, one shot to stop Dr. Andersen before it was too late. He quickly signaled to the authorities, who had been positioned outside the manor, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But would they arrive in time? Cliffhanger ending. Just as Dr. Andersen raised his arms to initiate the ritual, a loud crash echoed through the manor. The doors burst open and a team of officers stormed into the room, guns drawn. But it was too late. Dr. Andersen had vanished into thin air. In the chaos that followed, Poirot's eyes locked onto Miss Carnaby, who stood frozen, her face pale with disbelief. She had seen something she should have. The ritual had begun, but had Dr. Andersen truly fled? Or was this all part of a far larger game? As Poirot rushed to her side, he whispered urgently, "Miss Carnaby, we must act quickly. This is far from over." The cult members were now scattered, some fleeing into the night, others being taken into custody. But something remained, a question, a dread that still clung to the air. Had Poirot truly uncovered the full extent of Dr. Andersen's plan? The climax. The night had descended into a maelstrom of confusion, chaos, and fleeting glimpses of truth. The air, thick with tension, seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the final moment. Poirot stood at the edge of the scene, his mind a labyrinth of thoughts, every possibility unfolding and unraveling in his sharp mind. The grand ritual had collapsed into disarray, and yet, in the back of his mind, he knew this was not the end. This was merely the beginning of something far darker than he had anticipated. Dr. Andersen, the charismatic leader of the Flock of Geryon, had vanished into the shadows the moment the officers burst in. The cult members, stunned and confused, scattered like cockroaches under the harsh light of the truth. It was as though Dr. Andersen had planned his escape all along. But Poirot had never underestimated the man's ability to escape the law. In a split second, Poirot's mind raced. He knew that if Dr. Andersen got away, the truth would remain buried. The pieces of the puzzle broken and scattered could never be fully understood. Poirot's gaze flicked toward Miss Carnaby, who stood frozen in the center of the room, a look of disbelief etched into her features. "Stay close to me," Poirot muttered, his voice low but urgent. The cult members had been detained by the officers, but Dr. Andersen was nowhere to be seen. His escape had been too smooth, too precise. Had he anticipated the police arriving at just the right moment? Poirot's thoughts raced as his eyes scanned the manor's vast, dark corridors. "He's still here," Poirot whispered to himself. "He hasn't left." And then, as if the very walls of the manor were conspiring to reveal the truth, a sound echoed through the darkness, a faint rustling, followed by a door creaking open. Poirot turned sharply, his eyes narrowing with determination. "Quickly, Miss Carnaby," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "The chase is not over." They darted down the narrow hallway, the light from the flickering candles casting strange shadows against the walls. Poirot's sharp instincts told him that they were close, too close. The muffled sounds of Dr. Andersen's footsteps echoed ahead, growing fainter with every second. Without warning, a door slammed shut at the far end of the corridor. Poirot's pulse quickened. He knew this was the moment. This was the showdown he had been anticipating. With one swift motion, he turned the handle and stepped into the room only to find it empty. But before Poirot could react, a figure lunged from the shadows. Dr. Andersen's face was twisted in a mask of fury, his eyes wild with desperation. His once charming demeanor was gone, replaced by a raw, animalistic fear. "You think you can stop me, Poirot, Doctor?" Andersen spat, his voice dripping with venom. "I've built something greater than you can comprehend. The Flock of Geryon will live on, with or without me." Poirot stood unwavering, his hands clasped behind his back as he regarded the man before him. "You are a man who has built his empire on lies, Dr. Andersen. You have manipulated and killed to feed your own ambitions, and now you think you can escape justice." Dr. Andersen's breath quickened, and in a flash, he lunged toward the window, his hand gripping the frame as though he could will it to open. Poirot made no move to stop him. He knew it was too late. From behind them, the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hall. The police had found their way to the room. The last game had been played, and Dr. Andersen's escape was no longer possible. He turned toward the door, his expression a twisted combination of rage and resignation. "You may have won this round, Poirot," he growled, "but the game is not over." Poirot's sharp gaze followed Dr. Andersen as he was handcuffed and led away by the officers. The cult leader's eyes locked with Poirot's for a final unsettling moment. There was no defeat in those eyes only, the hint of something far more dangerous, something far more insidious. Poirot turned to Miss Carnaby, his face unreadable. "The truth has been revealed," he said softly, "but I fear the shadows remain." As the door closed behind the officers, the silence in the room grew heavier. The cult was broken, but was it truly over? Poirot's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle still tumbling over one another. Dr. Andersen had been the leader, but who else had been pulling the strings behind the scenes? Miss Carnaby, pale and shaken, finally spoke. "Poirot, do you think there's more to this, more than what we've uncovered?" Miss Carnaby, pale and shaken, finally spoke. "Poirot, do you think there's more to this, more than what we've uncovered?" Poirot's eyes locked onto hers. He said nothing for a moment, but the weight of his gaze spoke volumes. His mind, as always, was working, calculating, analyzing. "The game, Miss Carnaby," he said quietly, "has only just begun." Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot and Miss Carnaby stepped out into the night, the world outside seemed eerily still. The wind whispered through the trees, and the stars above glimmered with cold indifference. But Poirot's thoughts were far from the peaceful tranquility of the night. His suspicions were growing, his instincts telling him that this was far from the final chapter. Something remained, something unresolved, and Poirot knew, deep in his gut, that the shadows of the Flock of Geryon had only begun to reveal their true nature. He turned to Miss Carnaby, his face a mask of quiet determination. "The truth, my friend, is a complex thing, but I believe." A sharp cry interrupted him from the distance. It was faint, but unmistakable. "Poirot!" Miss Carnaby cried, pointing toward the manor. The doors to the manor had flung open once more, and a figure emerged from the shadows, someone who should have been long gone. Someone who had evaded capture. Dr. Andersen, alive. And this time, he wasn't alone. Poirot reveals the clever deductions. Final scene. The tension in the room was palpable, the air heavy with unanswered questions. Yet Poirot stood at the center of it all, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes sharp and calculating. The clock on the wall ticked ominously, as though the very seconds carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. Miss Carnaby stood beside him, still shaken but resolute, her eyes darting between Poirot and the officers as the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The room was silent except for the rustling of papers and the slow, methodical voice of Poirot as he revealed his deductions that had unraveled the web of lies and deception spun by Dr. Andersen and his cult. "You see, mon ami," Poirot began, his voice steady. "The case was not as straightforward as it appeared. No, it was much more intricate, much more calculated." His eyes flicked toward Miss Carnaby, who had gone undercover in the cult. She stood tall, no longer the frightened woman who had entered Poirot's apartment so long ago. It was Miss Carnaby's bravery, her determination to uncover the truth, that brought us closer to the heart of this dark mystery. Miss Carnaby flushed with surprise at the praise, her gaze shifting from Poirot to the officers, and then back to the door where Dr. Andersen had been taken into custody. Poirot's eyes twinkled with something between admiration and intrigue. "You see, I had suspected from the very beginning that this was not simply a case of mind manipulation, but rather a carefully orchestrated plot involving both psychological and physical manipulation." Poirot paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "The key was the poison, the subtle, slow-acting toxin that Dr. Andersen used during the so-called cleansing ceremonies. He never killed outright. No, he was far more insidious. His victims died under the guise of accidents, their deaths ruled as natural causes or misfortunes. It was only after Miss Carnaby infiltrated the cult and uncovered the ledgers that we found the first traces of it." He continued, his voice growing quieter but more intense. "Dr. Andersen had been targeting wealthy individuals, draining their fortunes through a network of deceit and false promises. The cult, a facade for financial exploitation, was his means to an end. The true brilliance of his plan lay in the manipulation of his followers' minds. He didn't just control their beliefs, he controlled their very actions. The coded letters, the strange rituals, each step was calculated to create the illusion of spiritual liberation while he lined his pockets." Poirot took a slow, deliberate step toward the fireplace, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of the mantel. But there was one thing Dr. Andersen did not anticipate. The human spirit, Miss Carnaby, is not so easily broken. She resisted his manipulations and in doing so uncovered the darkest secret of all, the secret that led us to him. Poirot's gaze met Miss Carnaby's, a rare smile playing on his lips. "It was you, my dear Miss Carnaby, who discovered the ledger with the names of the dead. You who realized the connection between the victims, and you who found the hidden message in Dr. Andersen's coded letters. You were the key, the final piece in this intricate puzzle." Miss Carnaby's heart raced at the recognition, her mind swirling with the realization that she had, in fact, been the one to expose Dr. Andersen's entire operation. She had been afraid, yes, but now, standing here in the light of Poirot's admiration, She felt something different, something stronger than fear. Poirot took another step forward, his voice lowering, almost to a whisper. And there was something else, something I have not told you yet. The coded letters, which you uncovered in the old study hidden in plain sight, you might say. They were not just a tool to expose Dr. Andersen's plan. No, they were also his final warning. He knew that someone would eventually come for him, and he had arranged for his escape long before we ever set foot in his manor. Miss Carnaby's heart skipped a beat. But I thought we had him. Poirot's eyes narrowed, a shadow of something dark flickering behind his usual calm. Dr. Andersen was always 3 steps ahead. But now, we know the full extent of his machinations. He may have escaped our grasp for now, but it is not over, Miss Carnaby. Not by a long shot. The officers, still reeling from the truth they had uncovered, began to murmur among themselves, exchanging looks of disbelief and confusion. Poirot, however, was unfazed. His mind was already racing forward, imagining the many ways in which the cult leader could have prepared for his escape. And then, it happened. A sudden, sharp knock echoed through the door. The room froze. Poirot turned to face the door, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. The door creaked open, and a uniformed officer stepped inside, a look of urgency in his eyes. "Monsieur Poirot, there's been a development. We've received a report. Dr. Andersen, he's not alone." The room went cold. Miss Carnaby stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. "What do you mean, who is he with?" The officer's words sent a shiver through the air. "A new figure has emerged. Someone connected to the cult. Someone we thought was gone." Poirot's eyes flicked toward Miss Carnaby, his expression shifting to one of quiet determination. "This, my friend, is where the true game begins. The hunt is far from over." Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot turned to leave the room, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Dr. Andersen's escape had not been a simple matter of fleeing the scene. No, this was something deeper, something far more dangerous. There was someone else, someone hidden, pulling the strings from the shadows. Poirot's mind worked in overdrive as he glanced once more at Miss Carnaby, her face pale with fear. "We are only at the beginning, Miss Carnaby. The secrets of the Flock of Geryon are far more intricate than we imagined, and the truth, I fear, may be far more deadly than we could have ever anticipated." And with that, the door slammed shut behind them, leaving the world outside to wait in silence. But Poirot knew, he could feel it in his bones, that the real danger had only just begun. The closing scene, classic Agatha ending. The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow over the small apartment, its beams flickering softly through the drawn curtains, and the scent of freshly brewed tea lingered in the air. The only sounds were the gentle clink of china and the soft hum of a distant clock. There, at the polished wooden table, sat Hercule Poirot and Miss Carnaby, their teacups held in hands that had once trembled with fear but now, in this quiet moment, were steady. Poirot, ever the impeccable figure, sipped his tea with his usual precision, his sharp eyes studying the room around him, as though still unraveling the threads of the case. But today, his gaze was softer, reflective, as if the complexities of the case had not merely been solved but had become something more. Miss Carnaby, her face no longer drawn with the tension of the investigation, relaxed in the chair opposite him. The last few weeks had transformed her, and though the events had left their mark on her, there was a new resolve in her eyes. She had been the one to push through the labyrinth of deceit, to face dangers that few others would dare. And now, in the quiet aftermath, she was a different woman, a stronger, braver version of herself. "You are a true detective, Miss Carnaby," Poirot said at last, his voice a rare note of admiration. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of his deep respect. His smile, small but genuine, held an unspoken acknowledgment of her bravery. Miss Carnaby's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes held a trace of something deeper, something both triumphant and sorrowful. The weight of everything that had unfolded, all the lives lost, all the lies exposed, still hung in the air between them. "I couldn't have done it without you, Monsieur Poirot," she replied softly, her voice almost a whisper. Your guidance, your insights, they were the key. Poirot gave a slight nod, as if dismissing the compliment, though there was no mistaking the quiet satisfaction in his expression. No, no, Miss Carnaby. You were the key. You saw what others did not. You uncovered the truth when it was hidden behind a maze of deception. There was a long pause as Miss Carnaby set her teacup down, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of the delicate china. She leaned back in her chair, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "It's strange," she murmured, almost to herself. "To think it all started so innocently. A simple investigation, a missing person, and now so much has changed." Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "That, Miss Carnaby, is the nature of our work. We follow the trail wherever it leads, even if the path is dark, and we must tread carefully. But sometimes," he continued, his gaze far away as though reflecting on the depths of his experiences, "it is the human mind that presents the greatest danger." Miss Carnaby raised an eyebrow. "The mind?" Poirot nodded slowly, his lips curving into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Ah, yes, the human mind, Hastings, is the most dangerous weapon of all." His words hung in the air, loaded with meaning, as if they were the final piece of an unsolved puzzle, one that had yet to be uncovered. It can deceive, manipulate, and destroy, all while wearing the mask of innocence. The mind is where true evil often hides, disguised by charm or compassion. Miss Carnaby's gaze softened as she took in his words. There was something haunting about them, something that suggested that the world was not as it seemed, that perhaps the greatest mysteries lay not in the events themselves, but in the minds of those involved, in the quiet, unseen corners of human nature. Poirot's eyes briefly met hers, and for a fleeting moment they shared a silent understanding. It was a moment of rare connection and understanding that the case was not just about solving a crime, but about uncovering the complexities of the human heart and mind. Poirot had seen it all before, but with each new case, it was as if he discovered something new about the darkness that lived within people. Miss Carnaby stood, gathering her things, her eyes now carrying a steely resolve that hadn't been there before. "I suppose it's time for me to leave," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "The world doesn't stop turning after all." Poirot stood as well, offering her a polite smile, his eyes twinkling with that knowing gleam. "Indeed, Miss Carnaby, and yet, I suspect that we shall meet again one day." As she turned to leave, Poirot's eyes followed her, his thoughts lingering on the case they had just solved. But in the back of his mind, something else lingered. The human mind, always a mystery, always full of surprises. Just as Miss Carnaby reached the door, she turned back to him, a brief, thoughtful look crossing her face. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "do you ever wonder what comes next, after the case is closed?" Poirot's lips twitched into a knowing smile as he opened the door for her. "Ah, Miss Carnaby," he said softly, his eyes glinting with that familiar spark of mystery. "I do not wonder. I simply wait, for there is always another case, and another mind to unravel." As the door clicked shut behind her, Poirot stood still, staring into the quiet room. The ticking of the clock grew louder in the silence, almost as though it too were anticipating something yet to come. Cliffhanger ending. The last words of Poirot echoed in the empty room. "The human mind," he murmured to himself, "always a mystery, always dangerous." Just as Poirot turned away, a shadow flickered at the edge of the room, a figure slipping through the crack of the door, a brief silhouette that disappeared as quickly as it had come. Poirot paused, his hand on the edge of the chair. Slowly he turned back toward the door. He could feel it, the tension in the air, the whisper of an unseen presence. Another mind, another mystery, another danger. The game was never truly over. Not for Hercule Poirot,